Okay, in my last PowerPoint that deals with theme 3C, which is feminist theology and the changing role of men and women, we're going to look specifically at the ordination of women. We've already looked at the work of Rosemary Radford Ruther and Mary Daly, and now we're going to look at how the ordination of women has come to be, some of the issues concerning it, and some of the biblical justification for or against. So, let's look at a definition first of what ordination is. Ordination is a rite, and the rite sets apart certain individuals for specific roles within the church. It's a Latin term, comes from the Latin ordinatio, which comes from the word ordo, meaning order or rank. So it's about ranking within the church. And it comes from an earlier Greek word, keriatonia, which originally meant to raise the hand in order to elect. So behind ordination is the idea that people have been elected into a position, that their rank has somehow become higher. Now, the New Testament doesn't mention ordination at all and considers all Christians in some way to be ministers, because the word minister means those who serve. They serve others. So it's clear, though, in the New Testament that there were some people within the early Christian community who were set apart for certain tasks, and there are references to titles such as bishops, presbyters, and deacons. Today, modern ordination services in many denominations involve the church coming together, praying, laying on of hands, as we can see up here, and prayers for the Spirit in the lives of those it's setting aside for specific roles to take action and help them. So hopefully you now understand what ordination is. Now let's look at some New Testament references. So it's true to say that scholars note there were many women in leadership positions in the early church, and one female apostle is mentioned in the New Testament, and that apostle is Junia. My face is currently obscuring the picture of her at the moment. And Junia is mentioned in Paul's letter to the Romans in chapter 6, where he says, "Greet Andronicus and Junia, my fellow Jews who have been in prison with me. They are outstanding among the apostles, and they were in Christ before I was." So there, Paul is referring to these two people, Andronicus and Junia. Junia is a female name. They've clearly been in prison with Paul, so they've suffered for their faith. And Paul makes the points that they are apostles, just as the 12 apostles. And he says they were in Christ before I was. So that means they were Christians before Paul was converted on the road to Damascus. Now, interestingly, just to reflect the patriarchy of the church, etc., many early translations of the Bible altered the name Junia to the male form of Junias, as it was supposed that a female apostle must have been a mistranslation of Paul's words. Well, it wasn't. And other women in the New Testament were considered apostles by some traditions in the early church, and certainly the early Middle Ages. And those are people such as Mary Magdalene and the Samaritan woman at the well, who were both made saints. And indeed, in some of the oh, come on, Sprinkle, get a grip. In some of the works that didn't make it into the New Testament, some of the Gnostic Gospels, such as the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, in the Nag Hammadi texts, she plays a major part in the role of the early church. But as Mary Daly would say, and actually Rosemary Radford Ruther would say, the history was written by the men, and the women were ironed out or somehow eradicated in terms of what they did. So let's look at some biblical references here. There are also possible biblical references to female deacons and prophetesses. In 1 Timothy 3:11, Paul says, "In the same way, the women are to be worthy of respect, not malicious talkers, but temperate and trustworthy in everything." Now, some texts translate that word women as deacons. It could also be wives, or it could be women who are deacons. So there's a possibility that that text actually refers to deacons in some way, which is a status within the church. And then we read in Acts, and this is Luke writing, but when he refers to we, he's talking about him and Paul. Leaving the next day, we reached Caesarea and stayed at the house of Philip the evangelist, one of the 7. He had 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied. So there you see women were prophets in the early church. There are also non-biblical references to women leaders. There are stories told about holy women such as Thecla and Nino. You can see both of them here. Some descriptions of these figures maintain that their ministry was only restricted to other women, but other traditions indicate they administered to men as well. Certainly in the case of Nina, I think that would be true to say. So if you want to know a little bit about Thecla, there was a book called The Acts of Paul and Thecla circulating in the 2nd century, around AD 180 or CE 180. According to the text, Thecla was a young noble virgin from Iconium who listened to Paul's discourse on virginity, adopted the teachings, and became estranged to both her fiancé who was known as Thamyris, and her mother. And in fact, I believe her mother tried to have her and Paul arrested, and there's numerous stories of how Thecla was attempted to be burnt at the stake, and it didn't work because God saved her. You can go and do some research on that if you want, but certainly in medieval times she was seen as a saint. And of course Nino is held in great esteem by the country of Georgia. She is credited with bringing Christianity to Georgia, which I think at the time was known as Iberia. And is given the title, she's called in the Eastern Orthodox Church, she's known as St. Nino, equal to the apostles. That is her title. So you do have these references to women being like apostles, you know, the highest ranks within the early church. But of course, there are many arguments due to the fact that religion, certainly Christianity, certainly the way the church has formulated throughout the years into a patriarchal society, there are numerous arguments against the ordination of women. So in contrast to what we've seen in the previous slides, is the fact that actually it's very rare to find women in publicly recognised leadership positions in the church. And in fact, that has been the case for nearly 2,000 years, only up until really the last few decades. So the concept of apostleship as described by Luke and Acts, which were later than Paul's letters, limited them to 12, so all men. So 12 people were apostles and they were all men. In Acts we read about how the apostles elect another person to make up 12 following the suicide of Judas. Most theologians through the centuries have argued that women's ministry should stay in line with the New Testament idea of 12, and it should be men. So the sort of common arguments you get against women in ministry include things like God chose to incarnate himself in the form of a male, so therefore there's the patriarchy there and men are more important, so you don't have women priests. Christ appointed only men as the apostles, so therefore God does not want women to be priests because he chose men to be apostles. Some say changing now, ordaining women, would destroy the unity and Catholicity, worldwideness is what Catholicity means, of the church, which has for centuries ordained only men. Don't change things that have been established for years. And of course, certain scripture forbids the leadership of women. Some of those unpleasant verses in Paul that we've looked at, 1 Timothy 2:12, I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man. She must remain silent. So those sort of verses are used as examples as to why women should not be priests. However, things have changed. Since the 19th century, when movements for the liberation of women began intensifying, counter-arguments have been raised. And many people say, look, Jesus did not seem to restrict his message and teaching to men. He had a large following of women that went around with him. Many passages in the Bible refer to ministry in inclusive terms. In Jesus' ministry was about the poor, the dispossessed, people on the outskirts of society, and that would have included women. And obviously they cite those passages that we've looked at already where women were ordained into the deaconate of the early church. And not ordaining women has, Ruther and Daly would say the same as this, has been a part of the historical suppression of women. So there you go. So since the time of the Reformation, because it has to be since the time of the Reformation, because the Catholic Church still do not ordain women at all, so it only happens in the Protestant Church. Since the time of the Reformation, on rare occasion, some women were ordained or given public leadership positions in the church. But actually, it wasn't really until the 1970s that women's ordination became standard practice in established denominations. So the Church of England, and I'm going to look at the Church of England in more detail in my next few slides, the vote to ordain women passed by a narrow margin in 1992. But even though they passed that, in 93, the church voted to allow individual congregations to opt out of accepting women priests. So women were allowed to be priests, but the congregation were allowed to say, oh, we don't really want a women priest. Now, if you watch the first episode ever of The Vicar of Dibley, just that thing is implied in the first episode. In 1994, there were 1,500 women ordained into the Church of England, because that's when it started, but over 470 male clergy actually left the church in protest of women becoming priests, and actually moved to the Roman Catholic Church, who, when we come to look at unification of churches, really annoyed the Church of England, because they allowed those priests who moved from the Church of England to the Roman Catholic Church to continue to be priests even though they were married. So Anglican priests, Church of England priests are allowed to be married, Catholic priests are not. And the Catholic Church said, oh, you can come and be priests over here, and it's all right if you're married, that's okay, we'll allow that. So not exactly going for church unity there, and we'll look at that when we look at church unity and ecumenism in a later theme. So I've put a little timeline together that looks at how the major things on the ordination of women work. And particularly, I'm looking here at the Anglican Church, the Church of England. Now, the Church of England really applies to the Anglican Church in England. Anglican Church, because of the nature of the British Empire, is across all the ex-colonies of the British Empire. And what you find is that some colonies of the British Empire went for women priests earlier than we did actually in England. But if we go back to 1920, the Lambeth Conference, this is the main conference among all Anglican provinces, where they discuss issues relating to worship and changes in the church. In 1920, it was placed on the agenda of the Lambeth Conference. It was placed on the agenda, so they were moving in the right direction, but they didn't discuss it. So maybe they just paid lip service. When we get to 1930, they did exactly the same thing, and the same thing happened. It wasn't discussed. In 1935, the Archbishop of Canterbury's commission discussed women's ordination and just said, no, that's not going to work, and they turned it down. 1944, this lady up here on the top right, Florence Lee Tim Oy, she was ordained as a priest in Hong Kong during a wartime emergency. So technically the first ever female priest in the Anglican Church, 1944. I did say in previous slides, in rare occasions women were allowed to do it. It was a time of emergency, middle of the Second World War, she became a priest. In 1968, the Lambeth Conference discussed female ordination, but found arguments inconclusive. Now, what I should start to say now is that obviously, you look at me in the video and you think, what a fine young man we've got presenting these PowerPoints to us. But actually, I'm incredibly old, and I was born before 1968. I'm not going to say exactly when. So if you imagine that in my lifetime, There weren't, when I was born, there were no such things as women priests in the Church of England. So 1968, my lifetime, they found arguments inconclusive, so there were no women priests. We then moved to 1971. The Anglican Consultative Council passed Resolution 28, which authorised bishops to ordain women if they had the approval of their province. And this again is outside of England, in other areas where the Anglican Church is, so America, Canada, that sort of place. In 1974, 3 bishops irregularly ordained 11 women in the US. So they went against the Church of England and ordained women priests, 3 bishops in the United States. And in 1975, the General Synod of the Church of England determined there are no fundamental objections to ordination of women to the priesthood. So they're starting to move towards it around about 1975. In 1976, the Episcopal Church USA's General Conference voted to allow the ordination of women, and they accepted that these 3 bishops, those irregular ordinations, they now stood. So the ones of 1974 now stood. And then we jump to 1984. So in 1984, I was at university, and the Synod decided to ordain female deacons. In 1992, finally, and I'd been teaching for a number of years by then, the ordination of women was given final approval. Flying bishops were created for those parishes who couldn't accept gender equality. So if a parish wasn't going to accept it, flying bishops came in to sort out the congregation and bring them round. And in 1994, and I'd been teaching for 7 years by then, 12th of March, the first 32 women priests were ordained. However, this is absolutely key, they were allowed to be priests, but they weren't allowed to rise any higher, to the higher ranks, such as bishop or dean or bishop. They could only stay as priests, like your local vicar. And there is the news article from that day, which you could read about the coming of women priests. It talks a little bit about people moving out of the church as well. Okay, so think about that in terms of the patriarchy. It's almost like the men have allowed the women to be priests, but you're not going to have the top jobs though. And then we move to 2014. It took another 20 years, having allowed women to be priests, for the Synod to finally remove the barriers to women becoming bishops. And this lady here, Livy Lane, became the first female bishop on the 17th of November 2014. Now, my birthday is on the 16th of November, and in 2014, I'm not going to tell you how old I was, but I celebrated a major milestone of a birthday in 2014. So that's, in my lifetime, it took half a decade, that's not half a decade, half a century, you can work it out now, when I was born, and until a bishop was appointed to the Church of England in this country that I live in. And that's key, because I think you can look at that in terms of the top job. That's almost like saying, well, women can be teachers in the secondary school system, but we're not going to allow them to go any higher than a bog standard classroom teacher. You can't be a head of department, and you certainly can't be on the senior leadership team. That would be treated as ridiculous in our modern day society. And yet, in the Church of England, 1994, in came the first women priests, and then 20 years later, before they were allowed the top job. And actually, it has to be said that since 2014, the Church of England have moved forward. Now, between 2014 and 2018, almost half of new bishop appointments in the Church of England were women. So they are moving in the right direction, and now there's a huge influx. Now, what you might consider here is that, has this change resulted because they've allowed women to join the priesthood, Or you could flip it on its other side, and this is perhaps a little more controversial. You could say maybe the church is relented because they are struggling to get men to apply for the priesthood. There is a shortage of men, and the Catholic Church are facing exactly the same problem at the moment as well, a shortage of people coming into the priesthood. And it may be that eventually the Catholic Church might have to relent on women being priests, because actually they haven't got the people there to administer to parishes at the moment. So now there's a huge influx of women priests in the Church of England in this country. Vast majority of churches now with women priests. No, actually, don't make statements like that. I don't know that for a fact, but certainly huge amount of female priests now in the church. Now, when it comes to the Catholic Church, things are a little different. So most Christians in the world today belong to churches that do not ordain women. So, for example, women cannot be ordained as deacon, priests or bishops in the Roman Catholic Church. The same applies to the Orthodox Church as well. So Roman Catholic Church, vast church, and of course women cannot be ordained in that church at all. In fact, there can't be any form of priest whatsoever. But there is an extensive campaign to change that by many Catholics. And in 2014, Pope Francis affirmed the centuries-long tradition of refusing to ordain women to the priesthood. So in 2014, when am I doing this? I'm doing this right at the start of 2021, so only 7 years ago, the Pope said, sorry, we are not ordaining women to the priesthood. But he indicated a willingness to study the issue of women becoming deacons, so slightly below a priest to deacon, so possibly they can become deacons. So that allows them to lead services, conduct baptism, but what they can't do is celebrate Mass. They can't celebrate the Eucharist. But all those admin jobs, leading the odd service and conducting a baptism, that's all right. And in 2016, the Roman Catholic Church commissioned a study to look further into this issue. We still wait. So let's look at some of the current issues. It's my final slide, because whilst we've moved on a great deal since 2014, things in terms of women bishops, and we've moved a great deal on from 1994, when priests first started in the Church of England in this country, there are still issues. So when it comes to churches that ordain women, there's still issues that impact on the freedom of women to become fully equal to their male counterparts. So things like the proportion of unpaid women clergy has increased in many church bodies that ordain women. So they're doing the job, but they're not getting paid for it. Ordained women have had to fight for maternity rights in some denominations. Interview committees have been challenged, I couldn't believe this one, have been challenged to produce guidelines on appropriate or inappropriate questions for women candidates, such as if you're asking a woman at an interview, are you planning to have children? Amazingly enough, that's an inappropriate question. If we ask that in a teaching position to a female member of staff who's applied for a job, oh, are you planning on having children? We would be in really big trouble. You can't do stuff like that. It's blatant sexism, and it's disadvantaging women because of their gender. So it's a bit embarrassing that the church had to be told that those sort of questions aren't appropriate. And of course, we've still got the problem that many congregations who belong to church bodies that do ordain women still remain reluctant to accept a female minister due to that entrenched patriarchy that is in the church that people like Ruther and Daly talk about. So that is the topic of feminist theology. Hopefully it makes sense. Final thing I would say is that despite all that I've said in terms of the Church of England making things, appointing more bishops than they have been doing, it is still fair to say that women still find it difficult to access those senior positions. And quite often what happens is lack of experience is used as an excuse. However, you can make the decisions now. You should have more than enough to evaluate the issues with the biblical verses for and against women, whether the Bible is sexist or whether it isn't sexist, whether Ruth has got it right, whether Daly's got it right. and get an idea of the history of ordination in this country. As I said, that's feminist theology for you. Hopefully you have found this useful. Goodbye.